The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like fluorescent lights always do in hospitals at 2 in the morning, a white noise that most people stopped hearing after their first shift. Laura Bennett had stopped hearing it 3 years ago. She moved through Trauma Bay 3 with the kind of efficiency that went unnoticed by most staff, the way a shadow moves across a wall. Nobody watched the shadow. Nobody asked the shadow questions. That was exactly how she preferred it. Her scrubs were navy blue, standard issue, unmarked. Her name badge hung from a lanyard with 17 other night shift nurses' badges, all of them identical except for the photographs. Laura's photo was 5 years old. The hospital had a backlog. She had not requested an update. In her locker, on the highest shelf behind the spare compression socks, sat a locked metal box containing a passport under a different name, $8,000 in cash, and a certificate of discharge that she had never framed. The faded unit patch, olive drab with a single silver lightning bolt, was sewn into the lining of her jacket, the one hanging on the hook by the door. She touched it once before each shift. Not for luck. For remembering. The patient in bed 3 was stable. 63-year-old male, admitted 6 hours earlier through the emergency department with acute abdomen pain radiating to the left shoulder. Laura had already checked his foresight at 1:41 a.m., a 20-gauge peripheral line in the left antecubital fossa, saline running at 100 milliliters per hour, no signs of infiltration or phlebitis. His vitals were holding. Blood pressure 118/76. Heart rate 82. The kind of numbers that let you breathe for a moment. She moved to the next bay without looking back, her movements economical and controlled, every gesture serving exactly one purpose. No wasted motion. No wasted words. A young resident named Chen stopped her in the hallway, his face creased with exhaustion. He was maybe 27, still had that look in his eyes that meant he believed he could save everyone. Laura remembered that look. She had worn it once, a long time ago, before Bagram. Before the shrapnel. Before 17 years taught her that some things could not be saved, only survived. Laura, the monitor alarm in bed 1 won't stop going off and I can't find the override switch, he said. His voice cracked slightly on the word override. She did not say, I can walk you through it. She said, upper right corner. Turn it 3/10 of a rotation clockwise. The sensitivity is too high, not the monitor. He nodded and walked away. He did not say thank you. Most people did not. She did not expect them to. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered. Somewhere down the corridor, an automated blood pressure machine cycled through a reading. Someone's phone buzzed. Everything in a hospital made noise, machines beeping, ventilators sighing, monitors alarming, code pages crackling through the overhead speakers in voices that always sounded urgent even when announcing that Dr. Patterson had a visitor in the lobby. Laura had learned to filter most of it. Her brain sorted the sounds into 2 categories, relevant and irrelevant. Only the relevant ones penetrated. A sudden drop in oxygen saturation. A ventilator disconnecting. A code that was not hers to respond to but hers to be ready for. That kind of thing. Dr. Marcus Caldwell arrived during the 3 a.m. quiet, the part of the night when the hospital held its breath. He swept through the unit with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, tall, expensive watch catching the fluorescent light, suit jacket that cost more than Laura's car payment, the particular stillness in his shoulders that came from knowing the room would rearrange itself to accommodate him. 2 surgical interns followed in his wake like remoras following a shark. He did not look at Laura. She did not expect him to. The patient in bed 5 was new. He had arrived during Laura's break, transported from the VA hospital across town with incomplete paperwork and a blood pressure that was already trending downward. His name was Colonel Richard Hayes. Age 61. The admission note was sparse, abdominal pain, elevated white count, imaging pending. Laura had not read the details carefully until she saw the origin line, Bagram. She had not allowed her breathing to change. She had simply continued updating the medication list on the electronic record, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same measured rhythm they always did. But she knew that name. Every mother whose son served under Colonel Richard Hayes knew that name. The commanding officer who flew into the middle of firefights to extract wounded soldiers. The man who had called her own son, Daniel, 16 years old, enlisting with her signature because she was his mother and the military did not ask questions about solo parents, and said, "Your mother raised you right. We will bring you home." Colonel Richard Hayes. In Trauma Bay 5. Bleeding internally. Admitted under incomplete paperwork that looked hastily written. Caldwell approached Bed 5 like he was approaching a complaint he wanted to dismiss. He scanned the monitor without touching anything, read the chart without removing it from the nurse's station holder, and turned to the interns with the kind of smile that made people want to disappear. Elderly male, abdominal pain, probably diverticulitis or some other geriatric intestinal crisis, he said. Nothing exciting. He'll need imaging but it can wait until morning. Put him on antibiotics and 4 fluids and transfer him to medical. We do not have surgical beds for non-emergency admissions. The interns nodded and wrote in their notebooks. One of them, a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a bun so tight it made her entire face look painful, glanced at the monitor. His white count is 14,800. That seems elevated for simple diverticulitis. Caldwell did not look at her. Interns are not paid to think, Dr. Park. They are paid to implement the decisions of senior physicians. Write the transfer order. He turned and walked back toward the nursing station, his shoes making crisp sounds against the tile floor. Click, click, click. Like a countdown. Laura did not look at him. She was accessing the electronic record for Colonel Hayes' imaging results from the VA hospital, results that had somehow not made it into the current file. The imaging showed a ruptured spleen and a retroperitoneal bleed. A surgical emergency. The kind of thing that killed people if it waited for morning. She printed the imaging report quietly, her jaw steady, her breathing controlled. A trained observer would have noticed nothing. Most observers were not trained. She moved to the supply cart and organized the dressing materials in their customary order, each package in its place, nothing displaced. Everything exactly where it belonged. Except the photograph she had taken of the imaging report, which she slid into the pocket of her jacket before disposing of the evidence that it had ever been printed. When she checked the electronic record again, the imaging report had been removed from Colonel Hayes' file. Not deleted, someone knew how to delete, someone knew the difference between removing and erasing. Just missing. The way things went missing in places where nobody asked questions and nobody was supposed to remember what they saw. Caldwell passed her in the hallway outside the medication room. He was walking toward his office, his phone already pressed to his ear, speaking in that low voice doctors used when they were discussing money or politics or things that required the room to be empty. Laura stood against the wall to let him pass. He did not acknowledge her. She did not expect him to. She was just a nurse. Nobody. Unremarkable. The kind of person whose existence registered as a change in air pressure and nothing more. She had spent 3 years cultivating that invisibility. 3 years of keeping her head down, accepting assignments without comment, never speaking in meetings unless directly asked, never making eye contact longer than necessary. 3 years of erasing herself so thoroughly that even her own son had asked her, during one of their monthly video calls, if she was okay. She had told him she was fine. She had told him work was good. She had told him she was just tired, which was the kind of lie that sounded like truth. That night, during her break, she sat in her car in the parking garage on the 4th level where nobody went. Her hands did not shake as she accessed the locked compartment beneath the spare tire. Inside were documents that should not exist, a discharge certificate with seals and signatures, a badge that said Major Laura Bennett, photographs of operations she had been ordered to forget. The military had erased her records. The Pentagon had buried her decorations. An official memo, signed by someone whose name she no longer allowed herself to remember, had told her she did not exist anymore. Which meant if she defended herself, if she spoke about what she knew or what she had done, she would be admitting to something that officially had never happened. She added a photograph of the imaging report to the collection. 12 other photographs. Falsified records. Signatures that match Dr. Marcus Caldwell's other handwriting samples from the hospital system. A pattern. Evidence of a pattern. She locked the compartment again and sat with her hands on the steering wheel, breathing, doing the thing she had learned to do 17 years ago when her training began: separate the emotions from the data, understand that pain was information, understand that rage was just biology responding to threat. The parking garage light flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm wailed. Traffic hummed on the expressway 3 blocks away. Laura sat in the silence of her own vehicle, her hand steady, her breathing even, and did something she had not allowed herself to do in 3 years. She thought about why she was still alive. Because Colonel Richard Hayes was dying in Trauma Bay 5. Because his white count was 14,800 and his spleen was ruptured and his retroperitoneal bleed would kill him in exactly 6 to 8 hours if nobody intervened. Because her son Daniel had looked her in the eye during their last video call, before she enlisted, before she agreed to disappear into a role that required her to be invisible, and said, "Mom, I'm scared." And she had said, "Then you find your strength. You find it and you do not let go. You survive because people are counting on you to survive." She had been talking about herself. She got out of her car and walked back into Oak Creek Memorial through the emergency department entrance at 3:24 a.m. The waiting room was empty except for a man with a bloody towel wrapped around his left hand. The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent hum. She moved through the hallways with the practiced efficiency that went unnoticed by everyone except the one person who had noticed something was different. The one person who had scanned that imaging report for exactly 3 seconds before his expression changed and he made a phone call and he had the report removed. Dr. Marcus Caldwell had no idea what he had just done. He had no idea that the invisible night shift nurse he had passed without acknowledgement had spent 17 years training in circumstances he could not imagine. He had no idea that she had removed a piece of shrapnel from her own spine with a combat knife and kept walking. He had no idea that she had carried 2 wounded men to a helicopter while her own blood dripped into the sand. He had no idea who he was standing next to. And that was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. The 6 a.m. overhead page crackled through every speaker on the trauma floor like a benediction from the devil himself. Laura was updating the midnight incident log when Caldwell's voice rolled across Oak Creek Memorial, smooth as expensive whiskey and twice as poisonous. "Would Nurse Nightingale please report to the surgical wing? Our little Nightingale seems to have lost her way." The words hung in the pre-dawn silence like a challenge flag. Laughter rippled through the incoming day shift, confused at first, then recognizing the deliberate cruelty underneath. Someone snorted. Someone else whispered something that made another nurse laugh harder. Caldwell had done it perfectly, made her sound small, lost, diminished, in front of the entire floor waking up to their shifts. Laura took one measured breath through her nose. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, just enough tension that if you knew what to look for, you'd see the restraint underneath. She did not flinch. She did not look up from her charting. She finished the sentence she was writing with the same steady hand that had once held a tourniquet on a bleeding soldier's leg in a Bagram 8 station while incoming fire chewed holes in the tent walls. The pen did not shake. The letters did not waver. She turned the page in the incident log and kept working. That was the message: "You can throw your poison, Dr. Caldwell, and I will not drink it." She heard the day shift supervisor approach her station, felt the weight of pity in the woman's presence like a physical thing. Laura did not acknowledge it. She simply continued charting as if the page had never happened, as if her name hadn't been weaponized over the hospital's public address system to maximize humiliation. The supervisor lingered for a moment, a gesture of support that would cost her nothing and meant everything, then moved on to begin her shift. But that wasn't the worst part. Caldwell was patient. Caldwell was strategic. On the afternoon of the second day, when the corridor between the supply closet and the medication room ran narrow and quiet, he made his move. Laura was reaching for 4x4 gauze when his shadow fell across the shelves in front of her. She heard him before she fully registered his presence, the crisp scrape of his designer shoes against tile, the whisper of expensive fabric as he positioned himself between her and the exit. He stood too close. Deliberately too close. The kind of proximity that was meant to trigger something primal, fear, submission, the instinct to shrink. His cologne mixed with antiseptic and something underneath, the chemical smell of a man whose fear was beginning to curdle into desperation. "You're a sweet girl, Laura, but you're not smart enough to understand what you think you saw." His voice was conversational, almost kind. That was the weapon. Not the threat underneath, but the gentleness wrapped around it. "Stay in your lane, or I'll make sure you're stocking bedpans at a nursing home in Scranton by next month. Do we have an understanding, Nightingale?" The supply closet was maybe 8 feet by 6 feet. Fluorescent lights cast everything in a clinical pallor. The metal shelves held gauze, tape, bandages, the mundane materials of healing work. Laura stood perfectly still. She did not step back. She did not lower her eyes. She did not tremble or retreat into fear, though she could feel him waiting for exactly that response, waiting to see a small woman fold under institutional pressure. Instead, one tear escaped down her left cheek. Just one. Not the gasping, shoulder-shaking kind of crying that men like Caldwell expected. Just a single bead of salt water that tracked down her skin with the precision of a sniper's trajectory. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. "You're making a mistake you'll regret, Doctor," she said in a voice that was devastatingly calm, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived things that would break most people. The kind of calm that suggested she had looked into darkness far deeper than a supply closet and a man with a title. Caldwell's smile thinned. For just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, not fear, not quite, but the first recognition that he might be standing in front of someone whose bottom was much, much lower than his. Someone who had less to lose. Someone who had spent 17 years learning how to function in the space between life and death. Then he laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that echoed off the metal shelves. "Get back to work, Nightingale," he said, and left. But that wasn't what scared him. What scared him was that she had said it so quietly that only he could hear. No defiance in her voice. No anger. Just a statement of fact, delivered the way you might tell someone they had a spot of blood on their collar. The real campaign began 2 days later. Laura arrived for her shift on Thursday evening to find her schedule permanently altered. The charge nurse on duty, a woman named Catherine who had covered for her twice in the past year and who now avoided making eye contact, explained it with genuine apology, Caldwell's orders. Something about better utilizing your skills. Her trauma bay shift, the one she had held for 3 years, was gone. In its place, pediatric floor, day shift, starting Monday. The posting that every night shift nurse dreaded because it meant working under fluorescent lights that made the time stretch like taffy and surrounded by parents who second-guessed every decision you made. Laura said nothing. She clocked in and began her shift on the trauma floor anyway, waiting to see what Caldwell would do about the insubordination. But he didn't need to do anything. The badge access restrictions came the next morning. Her trauma bay login credentials simply stopped working. The system rejected her key card when she tried to enter the medication room. When she asked Catherine about it, the charge nurse's face flushed with embarrassment. "It's not my call," Catherine said quietly. Came down from Caldwell. Medication access restricted pending a competency review. A competency review? For a nurse who had worked trauma for 3 years without a single medication error. Laura overheard him on the phone in the hallway that afternoon, his voice carrying through the open door of the physician's lounge. He was pacing, agitated in a way she hadn't heard before, like a man who had realized the game was not proceeding according to his expectations. "I need her transferred to Mercy Hospital across town. Make it happen by Friday. I don't care what reason you give the board." The conversation ended with a click. She heard his footsteps approach, heard him pause as he realized she was standing 3 feet away. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. In his, she saw the first genuine flicker of fear. She had 3 days. Maybe less. That evening, after her shift, Laura sat in her car in the parking garage and made a phone call she had hoped never to make. Her son Daniel answered on the third ring, his teenage voice still carrying that particular exhaustion that came from studying for an advanced placement biology exam he probably didn't need to study for. "Mom? Everything okay? Hey, baby. I need you to listen to me carefully. Okay?" His tone shifted. Kids always knew when the conversation had moved into serious territory. "If anything ever happens to me, and I mean if anything ever seems strange or wrong, there's a box under my bed. You know, the box in my bedroom closet, under the floorboard? The one I told you about." "Mom, what's going on?" "Just insurance, baby. Just insurance. You take it to the FBI. You understand? The FBI, not the police. Can you remember that?" There was a long pause. She could hear him breathing on the other end, heard the careful calculation of a 16-year-old who had grown up around military families, who understood that adults sometimes asked you to do things before explaining why. "I can remember that," he said. "But Mom, I love you. I'll call you tomorrow, okay?" She ended the call before he could ask the questions she didn't have answers for yet. Before she could tell him about Colonel Hayes or the falsified records or the man who was systematically dismantling her ability to gather the evidence that might matter. Before she had to explain that she had spent the last 48 hours scanning documents during her breaks, feeding them into the ancient printer in the break room while other nurses filtered in and out, looking away politely because they had already learned not to ask questions about things that might get them killed. The locked compartment in her car now held 8 pages of falsified treatment timelines. 8 pages that showed a pattern, 3 other patient deaths, all with altered medication schedules, all with prescription refills that had gone out within 24 hours of each death. All connected to Caldwell's signature on the orders. He was running a pill mill through Oak Creek Memorial's Trauma Bay. Using the dying to generate legitimate prescriptions. Using their deaths to cover the paper trail. And Laura had exactly 3 days to prove it before he transferred her to Mercy Hospital and out of his reach. She gripped the steering wheel as rain began to hammer the parking garage roof, a sound like artillery, like the world drumming its fingers while waiting for something to break. In the rearview mirror, she could see her own reflection, a woman in scrubs with tied-back hair and eyes that had seen worse, much worse, and had survived it anyway. The question was whether she could survive this without breaking her silence. Whether she could stay buried as a nurse named Laura Bennett while the major inside her wanted to move with the fluid precision that came from 17 years of training. Whether she could hold on for 3 more days until everything fell apart anyway. She started the engine. The headlights cut through the rain like flares. The rain kept falling as Laura pulled into the lot behind the hospital at 10:41 p.m. She sat in the darkness for a moment, and still on the steering wheel, watching the droplets streak the windshield. The parking lot hummed with the sound of water running through gutters. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs, breathed once, twice, and opened the car door. The morning shift was arriving as she walked toward the trauma bay entrance. Caldwell was waiting by the ambulance bay doors, clipboard in hand, his expression already wearing the shape of triumph. He timed this perfectly. Witnesses. Sunlight. The incoming nurses still fresh, their attention still available for an audience. Bennett. He said her name like a prosecutor calling a case. A moment. She stopped. She didn't turn. The other nurses slowed, pretending they weren't listening, their scrubs bright against the grey morning light. Your charge nurse responsibilities are effective immediately revoked. He spoke loud enough for the group of 12 to hear. You'll return to general floor duties. Your access to the scheduling system is suspended. Your keys to the medication vault will be surrendered to Karen at the desk. Laura stood motionless. The rain had stopped. Everything was still. This is not a demotion. This is a reassignment based on your inability to maintain professional boundaries with the surgical team. Do you understand? She turned to face him. Her eyes were flat. Clear. The kind of eyes that had looked across valleys in countries she couldn't name. I understand. I'll need your response recorded. He raised his voice slightly, ensuring the growing cluster of nurses continued to hear. Your acknowledgement of these new responsibilities. I acknowledge. 2 words. No inflection. No plea, no defense, no question. Something flickered across his face. Frustration, maybe. He'd rehearsed a scene where she would break. Where anger would crack her composure or tears would soften her defiance. He'd prepared comebacks for arguments, for begging. But she had simply agreed, and that agreement carried the weight of something he couldn't quite identify. He waited. She didn't fill the silence. You'll also note that I've documented your pattern of insubordination over the past 72 hours. He flipped open the clipboard. Including refusing direct orders regarding patient assignment protocols and attempting to access restricted files without authorization. I accessed patient records as part of my clinical assessment. Her voice remained level. As permitted under hospital protocol. You accessed specific records belonging to patients you have no current assignment for. That's policy violation number 3. Around them, the arriving nurses had stopped moving entirely. 2 of them stood by the entrance, steaming coffee cups forgotten. This was the kind of moment that would circulate through the hospital in different versions, some more sympathetic, some more damning, all of them anchored to the image of their colleague being systematically dismantled in front of the morning shift. Laura's jaw tightened, just barely. A tremor passed across the muscle near her temple, so slight that only someone trained to read such signs would have caught it. She blinked. Once. Her hand came up, and she wiped her right eye with the back of her wrist, a single tear tracked down to her cheekbone in the cool morning air. She didn't look away from him. She didn't turn red. She didn't retreat. Instead, she lowered her hand and held his gaze with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. When she spoke, her voice was soft. Devastating. You're making a mistake you'll regret, Doctor. She walked past him toward the trauma bay entrance. The nurses scattered, suddenly attentive to their phones or their shoelaces or the fascinating texture of the parking lot asphalt. Caldwell stood frozen for a moment, clipboard still raised, his prepared follow-up stillborn in his throat. She'd given him nothing to destroy. No anger to punish, no tears to exploit, no fear to fuel his sense of control. By noon that day, he was already making calls. His office was on the 4th floor, and the phone cord stretched across his desk like a snake as he hunched in his chair. Laura heard about it 3 hours later from one of the respiratory therapists who'd been walking past the open door. He'd been speaking with someone on the hospital board, someone in administration, his voice taking on the practiced tone of a man filing a complaint. Unstable. Erratic. I'm concerned for patient safety, he'd said. The respiratory therapist had kept walking, hadn't lingered, but the message had already begun its transmission through the hospital's invisible network. By that evening, there were 3 emails in Laura's account from HR requesting a meeting. By midnight, she'd been officially notified that her file was under review. By 2 a.m., when she sat at the nurse's station during her shift, the hospital's institutional machinery had begun its slow, deliberate processing of her removal. Caldwell wanted her gone. Or transferred. Or broken. The exact mechanism didn't matter as long as the outcome was the same. She would be removed from the system, separated from the access she'd been quietly building over 72 hours. He didn't know what those 72 hours had produced. In the file room during her meal breaks, Laura had made for additional copies of Colonel Hayes's missing imaging reports. In the supply closet, she'd photographed the date stamps on the original surgical orders. In the medical records office, she'd documented the timeline of every decision Caldwell had made regarding the Colonel's case, the scheduling changes, the notation removals, the subsequent admissions of other trauma patients through the same pathway. She'd become something she hadn't allowed herself to be in 17 years, a collector of evidence. Her hands moved with the precision of someone assembling intelligence in a hostile environment. No wasted motion. No digital trails. Physical documents moved through the hospital in scrub pockets and tucked beneath the lining of her jacket, the same jacket with the faded unit patch sewn into the interior, olive drab fabric so worn it looked like a shadow, embroidered with symbols that meant nothing to anyone at Oak Creek Memorial, but everything to anyone who'd ever worn the same insignia. Thursday arrived like every other day. Rain came in the afternoon, then cleared. The evening shift began at 7 p.m., and Laura moved through the hospital the way she always did, a competent, unremarkable night shift nurse, asking questions about vitals, documenting observations, moving between rooms with the kind of focused attention that made her invisible precisely because she was so reliably present. By 2:56 a.m., the trauma bay had quieted. No incoming emergency runs. No major crises. Just the steady rhythm of observation and charting that comprised the slow hours before dawn. Laura was at the nurse's station when she first saw him through the window, a man built like a linebacker made of concrete and bad decisions. 6'7", 280 pounds minimum, his neck wrapped in tattoos that crawled up toward his jawline like vines reclaiming a building. He passed the security desk with the kind of confidence that suggested he'd already paid whoever needed paying. A visitor pass dangled from his wrist, laminated and official-looking, the kind of credentials that security guards barely glance at when they're tired and it's nearly 3 a.m. He moved straight toward the medical records area. No hesitation. No uncertainty about where he was going or why. Laura's hand found the security alert button and pressed it. Alarms would come. Security would arrive. But they would take 3 minutes, maybe 4. And he was already pulling file drawers open, his massive hands rifling through documents like a bulldozer searching for something specific. She stood. Her posture changed, some compression of the spine that squared her shoulders, some subtle shift of weight that moved everything into alignment. The careful civilian softness that had lived in her movements for 3 years evaporated. In its place came something that military muscle memory recognized like a second language finally being spoken again. "Sir, you can't be in here." Her voice was professional. Professional and empty of anything human. He turned. The file cabinet drawer was still open behind him, papers scattered across the floor like snow. He pulled his phone from his pocket, checked the screen, some image, a photograph, and looked back at her. His face arranged itself into the kind of smile that made it clear he'd been sent here because he was good at hurting people. "You're the problem I'm here to fix," he said. Then he overturned a crash cart with one hand. The sound it made was catastrophic, metal screaming across tile, equipment exploding across the floor, glass bottles shattering into glittering destruction. Oxygen tanks rolled like bowling pins. Defibrillator pads scattered. The noise of it echoed through the trauma bay like a controlled demolition. A resident, Dr. Chen, the young trauma fellow who'd only been at Oak Creek for 6 weeks, had been charting at a far desk. He stood, saw the intruder, and did exactly what trauma residents are taught to do. He moved toward the threat to protect the hospital, to protect Laura, to do something. The intruder's hand shot out and clamped around Chen's throat like a mechanical vice. He lifted the younger man 6 inches off the ground, his arm not trembling, his breathing not accelerating, his face not even registering the effort. Chen's feet kicked, useless. His hands clawed at the tattooed forearm. The veins in his neck bulged. Elsewhere in the trauma bay, nurses screamed. One ran for the emergency phone. Another sprinted toward the exits. The sound of footsteps became frantic. Someone shouted, "Security," into a radio. Laura moved. Not ran. Moved. The difference was calibration. Every motion was economical, efficient, stripped of wasted energy. She covered the 15 feet between the nurse's station and the intruder in approximately 2 seconds, her trajectory perfectly calculated to close distance and maintain sight lines. Put him down. Command flat. Military hard. The voice of someone who had spent 17 years learning to make other people do difficult things immediately. The intruder grinned. He shifted Chen's hanging body slightly, ensuring Laura could see that he could crush his windpipe without breaking eye contact. "You're gonna stop me, Nightingale." The name, that diminishing, patronizing nickname that Caldwell had spent 72 hours weaponizing, took on an entirely different meaning coming from his mouth. It became a description of something fragile. Something that needed stopping. Something he'd been sent to destroy. He dropped Chen. The resident collapsed to the floor, gasping, his hands immediately moving to his throat. The intruder lunged toward Laura, his mass moving with a kind of predatory intention that suggested he'd trained in violence the way other people trained in yoga. What happened next took 3 seconds. Laura pivoted, her weight shifting onto her back leg, creating space. His momentum carried him forward into nothing. She caught his overextended arm, rotated it 45 degrees past its natural range of motion, and let his own force become the mechanism of his destruction. Joint locks don't require strength. They require angle. They require understanding that the human body is a series of levers and that leverage is the only truth that matters. His body flew. Not dramatically. Not cartoonishly. The mechanics were simple. His arm bent the wrong way. His body followed gravity. He landed on his back so hard the impact forced air from his lungs in a sound like a wounded animal. He didn't move after that. Laura stood over him, her breathing steady, her hands steady, her posture already shifting back toward something less dangerous, less obviously trained. She looked at Dr. Chen, who was still on the floor, still gasping, still processing the fact that he was alive. "Get out of the trauma bay," she said quietly. "Tell security he's in here, he's contained, and he needs medical evaluation." Chen scrambled backward, his eyes still locked on the intruder, his brain still struggling to understand the physics of what he'd witnessed. Laura pulled for tubing from a nearby tray, looped it around the man's wrists and secured him to the crash cart frame. Not tight enough to cause vascular compromise. Tight enough that he wouldn't be standing up and trying anything else. Muscle memory had other names for this kind of restraint, field immobilization from her training at Fort Bragg in 2007, protocols that were supposed to be forgotten, supposed to stay buried in a classified file somewhere in the Pentagon's vault. Instead, she had just executed a textbook joint lock takedown in a Philadelphia trauma bay 3 minutes before sunrise. She checked the intruder's pockets while she waited for security. No ID. Cash. A burner phone with a single contact labeled finished, and one previous call log entry timestamped to 2:42 a.m. The first security guard arrived at 3:04 a.m., 57 seconds before the second one, and about 90 seconds before she heard Caldwell's footsteps in the hallway, responding to the emergency alert with a kind of urgency that suggested he already knew exactly what had happened. The security guard's footsteps echoed down the corridor. He hadn't heard the code yet. Hadn't heard anything except the emergency alert that pulled him from the third-floor station 5 minutes ago. Laura stood in the trauma bay doorway, watching the intruder's shoulders rise and fall. 6'7". Probably 260, all of it muscle wrapped tight under a black hoodie. His hands were the size of dinner plates. He'd come through the service entrance at 3:02 a.m. carrying a metal pry bar and an expression that suggested he'd been paid very well to destroy something. The young resident, Dr. Chen, 3rd year, barely competent on a good day, was pinned against the supply cabinet. The enforcer's left hand wrapped around Chen's throat. His right hand hung loose, the pry bar still clenched, ready to swing toward the chart room where Laura had been moving files for the last 48 hours. Every other staff member had already fled. The 2 nursing techs sprinted toward the stairwell. The attending physician who'd been suturing a laceration had backed toward the break room, phone already in hand, calling 911 even though the call had already been made. They knew what they'd heard through the grapevine about Laura Bennett. They knew she moved differently than other nurses. But they didn't know what that meant. Not yet. The intruder's eye swung toward Laura. She stood perfectly still in the doorway, hands at her sides, breathing steady. She was wearing purple scrubs and a trauma sheer holster. Her ID badge hung on a lanyard next to a button that read 25 years Oak Creek Memorial. None of that mattered now. None of that had ever mattered. His face twisted into something that might have been a smile. "You the nurse?" "Bennett." Laura didn't answer. She moved instead. The intruder charged toward her, his right arm windmilling the pry bar in a wide arc designed to clear space. His weight shifted forward. His feet committed. He was fast for someone his size, but speed and size only mattered if they connected. Laura stepped left. Not backward, left. She moved inside the arc of the swing, her feet positioning her perpendicular to his body. Her left hand caught his right wrist. Her right hand locked under his elbow. She felt the pulse of power in his forearm, the surge of adrenaline making him strong, making him dangerous. None of it mattered because she was thinking in geometry now. Angles. Leverage. The mechanical certainty of a body that weighed half his but understood how physics worked. She rotated her hips and drove his arm upward and inward. His shoulder joint reached the end of its socket. She heard the tendon stretch. She felt the moment when bone alignment became impossible. She pushed harder. The pop was audible. Wet. Violent. His shoulder dislocated with a sound like a thick branch snapping. The scream that followed came from deep in his chest, animal and involuntary. Laura swept his legs. He crashed forward, his weight slamming into the linoleum face first. She was on his back before his body settled, her knee between his shoulder blades, her weight distributed across his spine in a way that made movement impossible without amplifying the agony in his dislocated shoulder. The foot tubing from the overturned crash cart lay scattered across the floor. Laura grabbed it. Her hands moved on their own, binding his wrists behind him with the exact knot she'd learned 17 years ago in a dusty training compound in North Carolina. Cross, pull tight, loop back on itself. Secure. Military-grade restraint. Impossible to slip without breaking bones. She moved down his body, immobilizing his ankles with the same precision. The tubing bit into his skin. He was sobbing now, gasping, his free arm flailing uselessly. Laura applied pressure to the joint lock in his good shoulder, not hard enough to break anything else, just enough to guarantee compliance. "Don't move," she said. Her voice was flat. Clinical. The voice of someone who had restrained combatants before. The security guard arrived 40 seconds later. He came through the trauma bay doors running, hand on his radio, eyes wild. He saw the intruder hogtight on the linoleum floor. He saw Laura kneeling beside him with one hand still locked on his shoulder. He saw Dr. Chen standing against the supply cabinet, his throat already starting to bruise. The security guard's hand came away from his radio slowly. "Jesus Christ!" "Call the police," Laura said. She stood up, her breathing controlled, her hand steady. "Tell them we need an ambulance. He has a dislocated shoulder." The police arrived 17 minutes later. 2 uniforms, 1 detective. They found the intruder lying in the holding area where security had moved him, still secured, still crying. Laura had checked his pupils, verified his airway was clear, and confirmed that no other injuries had occurred. She'd done it the way a trauma nurse does, methodical, thorough, professional. As if she hadn't just neutralized a man sent specifically to hurt her. The detective asked questions. The intruder said nothing. Not his name. Not who sent him. Not why he was destroying medical records at 3 in the morning. He just lay there, his dislocated shoulder immobilized now, his face against the cold hospital floor, his mouth shut. By dawn, the Philadelphia police had nothing. They had a man with a dislocated shoulder and a weapon. They had no identification. No priors. No connection to Dr. Caldwell that any casual observer would find. The money trail would take weeks, and Caldwell would have made sure it didn't lead anywhere that mattered. But Caldwell had already seen the security footage by 7 a.m. The cameras in the trauma bay had captured all of it in high definition. He'd watched Laura step aside. Watched her lock that arm. Watched the man go down in under 4 seconds. He'd watched her restrain him like she was handling routine emergency protocol instead of neutralizing a physical threat. And by 9 a.m. Friday morning, Laura was sitting in the administrator's office on the 4th floor, and Ellen Voss was reading from a laminated sheet with one word underlined in red: termination. "Excessive force," Voss said quietly. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd been given explicit instructions to say these words. Unauthorized physical intervention endangering hospital safety protocols. Dr. Caldwell has documented his concerns about your behavior and your pattern of escalation. Caldwell stood by the window with his arms folded. He looked satisfied the way predators look satisfied when they've cornered wounded prey. Laura's military training screamed at her to defend herself. To explain. To tell them exactly what that intruder had been sent to do. To drag Caldwell into the center of the room and make him explain why security cameras had mysteriously disappeared from certain hallways. To demand they check the medication inventory and the supply chain protocols and the patient files that had been systematically altered over the last 8 months. But she couldn't do any of that. Because if she revealed who she really was, she broke operational security. She'd been ordered to disappear after a classified operation in Bagram went sideways. The military had erased her records. Buried her decorations. Told Major Laura Bennett she didn't exist anymore. If she spoke her rank, if she revealed her service, if she admitted what she'd been trained to do, she violated the terms of her own erasure. JSOC didn't appreciate loose ends talking to hospital administrators. So Laura said nothing. She turned in her badge. She watched Caldwell's smile widen as security escorted her toward the exit. She passed the trauma nurses standing in clusters in the hallway, their eyes full of questions she couldn't answer. She walked past Dr. Chen, who opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, thank you, probably, or an explanation, but Laura just shook her head once and kept walking. The parking garage was empty at 9:13 a.m. on a Friday. Her 2014 Honda Civic sat in slot C27, the same spot she'd occupied for 3 years. She opened the driver's side door and sat down without starting the engine. The seat was still warm from last night's shift. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and closed her eyes. 17 years. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts and a shrapnel scar that ran from her left shoulder blade down to her hip. 14 hostages extracted from a compound in Sanjin Valley. 2 men carried to a helicopter while her spine was leaking blood and her vision kept going dark at the edges. A field thoracotomy performed with a combat knife on a sergeant named Morrison who'd taken shrapnel through the left lung while suppressing enemy fire so Laura and 2 wounded soldiers could reach the extraction point. Morrison had survived. He'd sent her a Christmas card once, from Walter Reed, before the military made her disappear entirely. And she'd given all of that up. She'd been ordered to give it up. She'd agreed because operational security mattered more than any individual life, even hers. So she'd become a night shift nurse at a trauma hospital in Philadelphia. She'd kept her head down. She'd worn purple scrubs and a smile and she'd told nobody. And Caldwell had found her anyway. The lights in the parking garage flickered on automatically as the afternoon dimmed. Laura sat alone in the driver's seat, unable to move, unable to cry. The military had trained that out of her, unable to do anything except press her forehead against the steering wheel and feel 17 years of sacrifice collapse like a building being demolished from the inside out. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had no idea what was about to walk through Daniel's front door the next morning, or what her son had been keeping in that locked metal box hidden under his bed, or that the military never truly erased you. They just made you wait. They made you disappear. And then, at exactly the right moment, they brought you back. The hospital administrator's office was sterile and cold, the kind of room designed to make bad news feel inevitable. Laura stood at the edge of the mahogany desk, her hands at her sides, watching Director Hayes read from a printed statement. It was 7:02 a.m., exactly 18 hours after the intruder had hit the floor with his shoulder dislocated and his consciousness fractured. Excessive force. Hayes didn't look up from the page. Unauthorized physical intervention. The board has reviewed the incident report filed by Dr. Caldwell, and we have no choice but to terminate your position effective immediately. The words landed like stones in still water. Laura's jaw tightened. 1 breath. 2. She didn't blink. Hayes continued, his voice taking on the practiced tone of a man reading from a legal document. Your actions, while well-intentioned, exceeded the scope of nursing practice. A security team was en route. Your intervention. The intruder had a resident by the throat, Laura said. Her voice was flat, level, the voice of someone stating facts to a wall. 10 words exactly. No inflection. No defense. Regardless, we cannot condone. The door opened. Dr. Caldwell entered, his tailored suit pressed to a knife's edge, his expression arranged into something between concern and injured innocence. He moved to the chair across from Laura as though she were furniture, something to be stepped around and forgotten. Director Hayes, Caldwell said, his voice carrying the warmth of a man who'd already won. I wanted to speak to you personally about what happened last night. I'm deeply troubled. That young woman, well, she's always been emotionally unstable, hasn't she? Working nights, isolated, no real career trajectory. And then this violent outburst. Laura felt the temperature drop in the room. This was what Caldwell excelled at. Not the confrontation. The reframing. He moved through the narrative like a surgeon making incisions only he understood, each word positioned to justify itself. I happened to be in the corridor when she returned, Caldwell continued, his eyes never touching Laura. The resident had already radioed for help. The intruder was subdued. But she kept going. Dislocated his shoulder. Restrained him in a manner that seemed almost. He paused, searching for the word with theatrical precision. Practiced. Professional, even. As if she'd done this before. Hayes's pen stopped moving. I'm wondering, Caldwell said, turning slightly toward Laura with an expression of faint concern, whether we need to be concerned about this employee's background. Her mental state. These kinds of episodes can escalate. Laura said nothing. Her hands remained at her sides. Calm as surgery. Calm as the moment before the helicopter rotors began their percussion against the sky at Bagram. The decision stands, Hayes said quietly. You're terminated. Security will escort you out. You'll receive 2 weeks severance and your final paycheck will be mailed. Caldwell smiled. Just barely. The smile of a man who'd orchestrated a symphony and heard the final note land exactly as planned. Laura walked to the door. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical hymn. She didn't look back. The parking garage at 8:23 p.m. was empty except for her Honda Civic, parked in the same spot it had occupied every night for 3 years. The engine was dead. She sat behind the wheel with her forehead pressed against it, her hands gripping the rim with a pressure that should have crushed bone. 17 years. 3 purple hearts that hung in a safety deposit box under a name that no longer existed. 14 hostages extracted from a compound where every shadow had teeth. 2 wounded men, 1 bleeding from a femoral artery wound, 1 missing half his left foot, both of them carried 40 meters to the helicopter while rounds snapped the air like predatory birds. A shrapnel strike to her lower spine that still ached on cold mornings. Promotions. Commendations. Crosses. All of it buried under so much classified operational security that she'd learned to forget it herself. And then 3 years at Oak Creek. 3 years of being invisible. Of stepping aside in hallways. Of accepting the nickname Nightingale without complaint. Of watching residents order her around like she was a filing cabinet with a pulse. 3 years of waiting for something, some moment when she'd matter again. The moment had come. She'd done exactly what she'd been trained to do. And it had cost her everything. Rain hammered the windshield like applause from a crowd that didn't care. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of restraint. The same restraint that had kept her silent through humiliations. That had made her smile and apologize and accept the unacceptable. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was rage learning to wait. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in 11 years. But that wasn't the lowest point. The lowest point came 23 hours later, in the hospital administrator's office, when a 16-year-old boy in a school blazer walked in and slammed a locked metal box onto the mahogany desk with enough force to crack the finish. Daniel's voice was sharp as a scalpel. You fired her. Director Hayes looked up from his desk, startled. Behind Daniel, a nurse poked her head into the hallway, confused. This was the part of the story where nobody moved. Nobody breathed. This was the part where the rules bent. I don't know who you are, Hayes began. Daniel Bennett. Her son. He turned the box around, produced a key, and opened it. Inside, arranged like artifacts from another world, were documents in military-issue folders. Red borders. Classified stamps. Names redacted with black marker except where they weren't. Except where the names remained in crystal clarity. Major Laura Bennett, Daniel read aloud, his voice cracking just slightly. United States Army Special Forces. 18-year career. Active combat deployments, 2006 through 2019. Hayes' face had gone the color of old pennies. Daniel lifted another sheet. Another. His hands moved with the precision of someone who'd memorized every word, every date, every citation. Bronze Star for meritorious service. Silver Star for gallantry under fire. 2 Purple Hearts. A pause. His voice steadied. And a Navy Cross. The door at the far end of the hallway opened. A man in civilian clothes stepped through, pressed jeans, a windbreaker that hung off shoulders broad enough to have their own zip code, eyes that had the unmistakable clarity of someone who'd seen violence so direct and so terrible that regular fear couldn't touch him anymore. His name was Commander Thomas Mitchell, and he had served at Bagram during the same rotation as Laura Bennett. The extraction at Bagram, Mitchell said quietly, stepping into the doorway. We lost 14 people in that compound. 14 hostages. The only reason those people are alive right now, the only reason, is because one officer made the decision to breach a door that should have been left alone, breach a compound where every corner was manned, breach the kind of situation that doesn't produce survivors. Hayes was frozen. A statue with a pen in his hand. Mitchell continued, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, low, powerful, capable of moving through anything in its path. She led that extraction. She took shrapnel to the spine when a mortar round came through the north wall. She was bleeding out, and there were 2 men down. She picked up one with a femoral artery wound. Carried him. Carried the other. 40 meters. While rounds were coming. She flew them both out at 2:15 a.m. on November 14, 2018. The senior trauma nurse, Margaret Chen, who'd worked with Laura for 3 years without ever suspecting, entered behind Mitchell. She had the discharge summary in her hands. The medical records from the field. The documentation that matched names and dates to the classified folders on the desk. Her hands were shaking. I've worked alongside Laura Bennett for 3 years, Margaret said, her voice thick. I watched her save lives. I watched her calm terrified residents. I watched her do things I didn't understand until right now. She looked at Hayes. Her eyes were wet. You fired a Navy Cross recipient. A major. Someone who has more valor in her little finger than most of us have in our entire bodies. And you did it because a pill mill doctor needed her gone. The silence was so thick it had mass. Then, from the hallway behind Mitchell, a phone rang. A federal phone. The kind that doesn't ring in hospitals very often. FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres answered it, listened for 10 seconds, and then turned toward the conference room with an expression that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment her entire career. Dr. Marcus Caldwell, she said, stepping into the office. You're under federal investigation for opioid distribution conspiracy, falsification of medical records, and conspiracy to commit assault. We need you to come with me. What happened next took 6 hours. In a private conference room at the federal building downtown, Torres and her partner, a DEA agent named James Holloway, laid out the architecture of Caldwell's operation like pieces on a chessboard. 3 hospitals. 17 doctors. 42 pharmacists. Pharmaceutical distributors. Insurance adjusters. Pill mill networks that had pumped opioids into a city already drowning in addiction. And at the center of it all, treatment records, falsified, tampered with, strategically altered to cover timeline discrepancies. Colonel Richard Hayes had been a victim. Laura had witnessed the falsification. She'd become a threat. The intruder, a man named Devlin Cross, 6'7", 94 convictions for assault, had been sent by Caldwell's partners in the operation. Destroy the records. Eliminate the witness. Simple math. But Caldwell had made a tactical error. In his desperation to silence Laura, he'd launched a background investigation into her. A personal investigation. And personal investigations into individuals with classified military records trigger federal flags. The FBI had been watching, waiting, accumulating. When that flag went up, the entire operation was suddenly under federal scrutiny. Caldwell's own weapon had destroyed him. By evening, news vans were circling Oak Creek Memorial like predators circling wounded prey. The hospital board held an emergency session at 9:53 p.m. By 11:06 p.m., Dr. Marcus Caldwell's hospital privileges were revoked. By the next morning, the state medical board had suspended his license pending criminal investigation. The trial date was set for 4 months out. Within 48 hours, Laura was reinstated to her position with back pay. A formal apology. A memo stating that the previous termination was procedurally invalid. Director Hayes resigned 3 days later. But the story had already spread. Commander Mitchell made 3 phone calls. Those 3 calls reached Senior Command at Joint Special Operations. Those calls triggered a review board examination into whether Laura's operational security burial was still operationally necessary. The answer, after deliberation, was no. The Bagram operation was 11 years distant. The personnel involved had rotated through 6 different postings. The hostile actors had been detained or killed. The case was sufficiently compromised by time and attrition that unsealing her records posed no active threat to ongoing operations. 6 months later, on a Sunday afternoon in May, Laura stood in dress blue she hadn't worn since 2019. The uniform fit perfectly. The patches on her shoulders felt like language she'd forgotten she could speak. The faded unit patch from inside her jacket lining, the one she'd kept sewn inside her civilian clothes for 3 years, was now where it belonged, stitched to the shoulder of her military uniform. The ceremony took place at the Philadelphia Veterans Hospital. 2 purposes. 2 flags. 2 sets of medals being officially recognized and returned. Daniel stood beside her in a suit, tears streaming down his face. Not from sadness. From the simple overwhelming relief of seeing his mother exist again. Colonel Hayes's widow, Sarah, approached Laura after the ceremony. Her hand trembled as she gripped Laura's arm. "Richard wrote about you," she said, her voice breaking. "In his letters home. He said you were the best officer he'd ever served with. He said you saved lives because you understood that every single person mattered. That you'd taught him that." She stepped closer. "Thank you for trying to protect him. Even after. Even when nobody knew who you were." Laura embraced her. Said nothing. What words existed for this? Outside, the sun moved lower across the Philadelphia skyline. 6 months after that ceremony, Laura walked past a strip mall on her way to the Veterans Hospital. There, at a folding table wedged between a nail salon and a discount phone store, sat Marcus Caldwell. His suit was cheap polyester. His shoes were worn at the heels. He was selling supplemental insurance policies, the kind that people bought when legitimate health insurance failed them. His trial was scheduled for next month. His conviction was virtually assured. He looked up as Laura passed. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. He looked away first, his face collapsing as though someone had removed the skeleton from inside. She didn't stop walking. Inside the Veterans Hospital Trauma Bay, Laura Bennett, Major Laura Bennett, moved with a fluid precision that her staff now understood was 3 things at once: a nurse's competence, a soldier's muscle memory, and a legend's gravity. The residents watched her with something between awe and reverence. When she gave an order, it wasn't a suggestion. It was a command delivered with the weight of someone who'd spent 17 years earning the authority to give it. A new patient arrived at 2:15 a.m. A Special Forces operator, 28 years old, with a complex traumatic injury from a training accident. He was angry, refusing treatment, threatening to leave against medical advice. His jaw was set like reinforced concrete. Laura approached his bedside. She didn't say anything at first. She simply pulled the faded unit patch closer to her neck, tilted the fabric, and showed him the insignia. Then the dog tags. Then the eyes of someone who'd stood where he was standing. "Sergeant," she said, her voice carrying the weight of command. "I know what you're feeling. I know what you think you have to prove. I know the difference between pain and weakness. But right now, in this moment, your mission is to let us help you." "That's an order." The soldier's resistance crumbled. He nodded, closed his eyes. "Let the 4-line be placed. Let the monitors be attached. Let the machinery of healing begin." Later, Daniel visited her office. He stood looking at the wall where her medals now hung, Bronze Star, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Navy Cross in its velvet case, catching the light like captured lightning. Above them, photographs of her unit. Names and faces she could finally claim in public. Was it worth it? Daniel asked. All those years hiding. Laura looked out the window at the city beyond the glass. At the lights beginning to flicker as evening fell. She thought of the 14 hostages. The 2 wounded men. Colonel Richard Hayes's widow. The Special Forces operator now healing in Trauma Bay 3. She touched the unit patch on her shoulder. "Power is not a title, Daniel," she said, turning to him. "Power is the ability to help. I never stopped having that. I just had to remember it." She embraced him. Outside, rain began to fall again, the same percussion that had hammered her windshield in the parking garage 6 months earlier. But inside the Veterans Hospital Trauma Bay, the sound was different. It was the sound of something being rebuilt. If you enjoyed this story about a hero who refused to stay hidden, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another episode. Leave a comment below. What would you have done in Laura's position? How long could you have waited? And if you know someone who's been underestimated and then vindicated, share this video with them. Sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones carrying the most weight. Thank you for listening.